Hi folks, in this video we're going to be looking at painting this fiery orange red of the Votann plasma axes. So without any further ado, let's cue the music. To start out with, I'm going to be laying down a base coat of Averland Sunset from Games Workshop. You might find that this takes 3 or 4 thin coats over a dark primer, but will cover a lighter primer over in 1 or 2 thin coats. I've gone for a black primer here due to generally black primer is a good place to start for painting minis that have lots of metallic sections on them, or Under Armour as you see with the Votann minis. And it's just a matter of getting a nice, smooth, thin coat down, waiting for it to dry and putting the next one upon it. Nice and simple, and it gives us a good point to start for our orangey red glow. And here you can see that base coat after 3 thin coats. I've painted the back blade of the axe as well, just so you can see how this technique is going to be applied to different styles of shapes. With the base coat now dry, I'm coming in with a very thin layer of white. And for this I have chosen Vallejo's matte white, but you can use any white that you want. And I've thinned this down much heavier than usual, so it's almost a wash consistency, but it's a lot thicker still. The pigment still holds together rather than running everywhere like a wash would. With this thin white paint, I'll be flowing this into the recesses of the axe, and the idea here is to represent that the start of the blade, near the hilt, is glowing white hot. And to ensure that there's a nice smooth transition between the white paint and the yellow base coat, I'm rinsing off my brush and feathering out by running slightly over the wet paint so that it blends into the yellow. And we don't have to be perfectly neat with this. It's quite a small scale and no blend is ever neat, but the more thin you have your paint and the more layers you do with this, doing a small area each time and feathering it out with a clean wet brush, you'll get a much more smooth transition. We are going to be coming in with some much brighter oranges and red, which will really help push the contrast and hide any issues that we have with blends not being quite so smooth due to the small area that we're focusing on. If you want to save some time when doing your plasma weapons, you can always skip this step, but if you want to reserve this for your character models, then go right ahead. With the white paint now dry, we're going to come in with our first stage of the orange highlight. And to do this, I have heavily thinned some Fire Dragon Bright from Games Workshop. And what we want to be doing with this is covering about 3/4 of the yellow area, and what we want to be doing is pulling the brush towards the edge of the blade. When you apply paint to a model, the pigment is left most concentrated where you pick the brush up from the model. So to aid us with our transition of colour, we're going to be moving the brush in a left to right or a right to left motion, whichever you prefer, and covering towards the edge of the blade, the sharp cutting point, with this Fire Dragon Bright. To really ensure that you get nice smooth transition, I would always recommend doing this in lots of thin coats and keeping this paint quite thin, almost to a glaze consistency, and making sure that you get that nice coverage of about 3/4 of the yellow. And if you do this in lots of thin coats, you will find yourself getting a really nice smooth gradient between that Averland Sunset yellow and the Fire Dragon Bright. And here I am finishing up the 4th or 5th glaze of this colour, and as you can see we're getting a really nice vibrant transition between that white and the orange tone. For our next highlight, I'm coming in with some Wild Rider Red from Games Workshop. Now don't be fooled by this name, this is still very much an orange paint. It's just more on the reddy side rather than the yellow side. And with this, I'm thinning this down to a similar consistency as the last step, so slightly thinner than a layer, but slightly thicker than your usual glaze. And I'm looking to cover maybe 1/3 to 50% of the previous painted area. And once again, once applying this paint, washing off my brush and then feathering it out to get a nice smooth blend between the 2 areas, and looking to cover this over in 4 to 5 really thin glazed layers. And if you take your time with this and push the pigment towards the cutting sides of the blades, you're going to end up with a really nice smooth transition. And as you can see, this is how thin it is on my hand here, and I'm doing short motions pushing the paint towards the edge of the blade, and I don't worry too much about any sort of striping marks we're going to get, because this is where we use the feathering with the wet brush to really soften out that transition and that colour, allowing the previous Fire Dragon Bright to come through at the edges while still maintaining that Wild Rider red at the edge of the blade. As with all of these layering and glazing steps, don't be afraid to come back in with your previous colour if you think you've gone too far or you've created a too harsh transition between the colours. This technique does take a bit of practice, and I would recommend doing on a spare blade that you have in your kit, or even on a piece of sprue, just to get an idea of how the paint flows and pushes around. For our last highlight, I'm coming in with Evil Sunz Scarlet from Games Workshop. And once again, I'm quite heavily thinning down with this, and I'm only covering maybe the last 10% of the axe blade with this. And once again, I'm pushing the pigment right to the cutting edge of the blade and focusing on being quite thin. It's almost a line highlight at this point, almost a big chunky edge highlight. But as you can see, we've got that really nice transition now between that really hot, vibrant white and the red cutting edge of the axe. And if you feel like the cut is too sharp and you have a very strong line between the orange and the red, you can always come in, like I'm doing here, with a wet clean brush and feathering out the transition. Once the red has dried, as an optional step, I'm coming in with a pure black here. In this case I'm using matte black from Vallejo, and I'm doing some dots, scratches and an edge highlight along the very cutting edges of the blade, and this gives that sort of lava impression of the very hot at the core of the blade, but it's starting to cool down at the edge. And with this you've got to be really careful to catch that very edge, otherwise you'll end up with a red black red transition like I've got here. In this I'm probably going to have to go in, make that black area thicker there, or I'd have to come back in and work on the transition. This is a completely optional step. If you prefer the glow of that white to red, then you may want to skip this step. Some of these Votann plasma weapons have these recessed rune details on them, and when we have this transition of colour going on, that definition of detail can get lost. So what we're going to do here is define the recess of this, and to aid in this I'm going to be giving this an all over coat of a gloss varnish. It's very important that each layer of paint underneath this gloss varnish is dry, otherwise you're going to get some smudging and smearing and your hard work in creating this transition will be ruined. Now what I do recommend is, before we go into the next step, really do make sure that this paint is 100% dry. With the gloss varnish dry, you can see that the plasma blade has a real reflective shiny nature to it, and this is going to help us allow our very thin paint to easily flow into the recesses. The colour I'll be using for this is Evil Sunz Scarlet. I wanted to use the colour that we've already used to help really tie this in as one piece. And with this very heavily thin paint, as you can see from my palette, I'm just going to touch it into the recesses. Now the gloss varnish is really going to help this flow into the recess. And if you use too much, you can dab it away very quickly, or you can wait for it to dry and you can come back in with another colour. But generally you won't have to do very much with this. And all that remains to do is to take away the shininess of the gloss varnish by either giving it a coat of some matte varnish or a coat of some matte medium. And that'll get rid of any weird lumps and bumps and shiny surfaces that you have on your axe blade. And with that, this Votann plasma axe is now complete. If you liked this tutorial and finally made it to the end of this quite long video, why not consider subscribing? It's free of charge, it helps me out, and you'll get further updates and videos just like this in your YouTube feed. So, until next time folks.